Hello, I am Mark Bleschner, psychoanalyst in New York. I'm going to speak to you about Bertha Pappenheim, an extraordinary woman who was the founder of social work in Germany and a leading feminist of the 20th century. Bertha Pappenheim was also the real name of the first psychoanalytic patient, Anna O., described in the 1895 book Studies in Hysteria by Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud. I've discovered that Bertha Pappenheim was connected with members of my family. 3 years ago, I received an oil portrait of her, the one you see here, along with some unpublished documents and many of her books that have expanded my understanding of her extraordinary life. I also have one of her dreams. Even if you've already read much of the literature about Anna O., I hope you will still learn new things from this presentation. I believe I've been able to get some unique information about her, her clinical history, her achievements as a feminist, and her sense of herself in the society of her time. Most especially, I would like to focus on her contributions and innovations to psychotherapy, connecting psychopathology and social pathology that she developed both in her own treatment and her battles against social prejudice in her later life. I will show you how her experiences and her ideas are connected to those of Harry Stack Sullivan, the founder of interpersonal psychoanalysis, and how they could be developed further in our own time. Pappenheim and Sullivan both clarified how you can understand individual psychopathology much better if you take into account the effects of social structure and prejudice. In the early 1990s, I was reading the biography of Freud written by Ernest Jones. I came to read that the first psychoanalytic patient, known in Freud and Breuer's studies of hysteria as Anna O., was actually a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. I also read that years after her psychoanalytic treatment, Pappenheim moved from Vienna, Austria, to Frankfurt, Germany, where she became the founder of social work and initiated many projects that protected women from sexual trafficking. She also started a home for Orthodox Jewish unwed mothers. Most of my mother's family, who escaped the Nazis in 1938, lived in Frankfurt at the same time as Pappenheim. So the next time I visited my grandmother, Amelia Darmstädter, at her home in Washington Heights, I asked her if she knew Bertha Pappenheim in Germany. She replied with enthusiasm, in half English, half German, "Oh ja, die Bertha, of course I knew her, she was a friend." She then reached into her bookcase and pulled out several books by Pappenheim, which she gave me. My grandmother was very intelligent. She read German poetry and literature, not just the classics, but the best of the avant-garde of her time, and her bookcase contained remarkable first editions, which I inherited. She was also very proper and upright, and had a strict sense of morality. I mentioned that Bertha had started a home for Orthodox Jewish unwed mothers. I knew in my bones that must have been scandalous, since Orthodox Jewish unwed mothers were not supposed to exist. My grandmother said, yes, she asked me to help her with the home. Of course, I could not get involved with something like that. However, my grandmother's sister, my great aunt Irene Darmstädter, did get involved. She worked closely with Bertha. Bertha Pappenheim gave the oil portrait painted of herself to my Aunt Irene. My mother's cousin, Ruth Dresner, became a social worker and wrote her dissertation on Bertha Pappenheim in 1954. Here is the cover page of that dissertation. Bertha Pappenheim, the contribution of a German Jewish pioneer social reformer to social work, 1859 to 1936. Ruth Dresner also wrote an excellent article in 1981, The Work of Bertha Pappenheim, in the journal Judaism. Ruth Dresner eventually received the portrait of Bertha Pappenheim from Aunt Irene. And then in 2017, Ruth Dresner retired from her clinical practice and gave the portrait of Bertha to me, along with books by and about Bertha. This led me to explore in much more detail the history of Bertha Pappenheim. First, here again is the portrait, and here's a closer view. You can see it's beautifully painted. When you compare it to a passport photo of Bertha Pappenheim from 1907, you can see the likeness, even though she looks older in the portrait. The artist signed the painting with the initials AK. I have so far not been able to identify the full name of the artist, even with the help of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. And if anyone has any clues about the identity of the artist, please let me know. I'm going to tell you about Bertha's life and her extraordinary achievements. But first, as a psychoanalyst, I must discuss the revelation of her identity by Ernest Jones. In our day, we would consider it a violation of confidentiality to reveal the identity of a patient without her permission. During her professional life, Bertha Pappenheim never spoke about her past illness and treatment by Breuer. The Pappenheim family was very angry about Ernest Jones' revelation. Paul Hamburger, Bertha's cousin, and also the executor of her estate, wrote a letter of protest. It appeared in German in Der Aufbau, a weekly newspaper printed in New York that was mostly read by German Jews who had immigrated to the United States. When I was a child, my father's mother read the Aufbau every week, and I learned a lot of German from reading Der Aufbau with her. Fortunately, today, through the miracle of the internet, the back issues of Der Aufbau are all online. And here's the copy with the protest letter by Paul Hamburger on May 6, 1954. I have translated it, and I will read part of it to you. In the last few months, there have appeared discussions in the Aufbau of the first volume of the Freud biography by Ernest Jones, and then various commentaries were published that dealt with the uncovering by Dr. Jones that Bertha Pappenheim was Anna O, whose hysterical illness became the object of scientific study by Dr. Breuer. I am one of the few still living survivors of the small family circle of Bertha Pappenheim, and as her executor, I'm in the best position to speak for the family and to establish that the family is not guilty in any way for the unforgivable lack of piety and respect for Bertha's personal privacy, nor did they agree to the uncovering of a medical secret that Bertha would never have tolerated during her lifetime. Much worse than the revelation of her identity is that on page 225, Dr. Jones adds a completely superficial and misleading report on Bertha's further life course after treatment by Dr. Breuer. Instead of sharing how Bertha finally was healed and how she was psychologically made healthy and began a new life as an active social worker, he gives the impression that she never recovered and her social work accomplishments and her righteousness were just another developmental phase of the illness. Whoever knew Bertha Pappenheim and her work in her later years would experience a disparagement, such attempts at interpretation by a man who never knew BP personally, along with the baseless description of Bertha's mother as something somewhat of a dragon. Bertha's picture will survive, not as a sick woman, but rather as someone who overcame illness and became a leader in the social elevation of humanity. He is right to protest, not just the breach of confidentiality, but the continued insistence by the psychoanalytic world to see her as a patient and not to acknowledge her evolution as a social reformer and pioneer. I want to explore what we can learn about Bertha Pappenheim's remarkable transformation from disabled patient to forceful leader of human rights and founder of German Jewish social work. Bertha was born on February 27, 1859 in Vienna, Austria. She was the third daughter of Sigmund Pappenheim and Rescha Goldschmidt. There were 4 children, but 2 died young. Her eldest sister Henriette died of tuberculosis when Bertha was 8, and her second sister Flora died at the age of 2 before Bertha's birth. Bertha's brother Wilhelm, known as Willy, was born 18 months after Bertha, and the 2 of them were the only children to reach adulthood. The relationship between brother and sister was harsh. They fought a lot, and she was constantly irritated by the privileges given to him just because he was a boy. Bertha attended a finishing school until the age of 16 rather. Although she was very intelligent and was fluent in multiple languages, she could not, as a woman, pursue a higher education. Her brother Willie continued his education and eventually became a lawyer. Women of Bertha's social class were supposed to stop their schooling, find a husband, and start a family. Bertha did not do this. Imagine her situation. A brilliant young woman being denied higher education and spending 4 years stuck at home cooking and doing embroidery. For someone as brilliant as Bertha, such a life was intolerable. She was terribly bored and would amuse herself by creating a private theater in her mind, in which she generated stories and plays. In 1880, when on vacation, Bertha's father became ill with tuberculosis. Bertha sat by his bedside at night, nursing him, and that's when her symptoms started. She developed a persistent cough, hallucinations, rigidity of her limbs, neuralgia, absences of consciousness, an inability to speak German and only speaking English, and a cross-eyed squint. Dr. Joseph Breuer, a prominent physician and also a friend of the family, began to see Bertha every day for a year and a half. One of the leading psychiatrists of the time, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who was the author of the famous Psychopathia Sexualis, was called in as a consultant, although we do not know what were his diagnosis and recommendations. Eventually, Bertha worked out her own treatment method with Breuer. She would trace back each symptom to its original cause, and the symptom would disappear. She called the process chimney sweeping and the talking cure. She had the idea of free associating to her symptoms and recovering memories connected to them. In effect, Bertha Pappenheim and Joseph Breuer co-created what would eventually become psychoanalytic treatment. Breuer told Freud about the clinical experience, and Freud pressed Breuer to write up the case. But this was more than a decade later. The publication of Studies in Hysteria was in 1895, whereas most of Breuer's treatment ended in 1882. So there was a 13-year time lag. In the Studies in Hysteria, Breuer indicates that when he ended the treatment in 1882, Bertha was essentially cured. But in actuality, things were more complicated. Bertha remained ill and was hospitalized at the Bellevue Sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, which you see here. Breuer wrote up Bertha's case for the hospital in 1882, which you can now read in Albrecht Hirschmuller's wonderful biography of Breuer, and compare to the later version he published with Freud. Among other things, Breuer notes how Bertha was deprived of intellectual stimulation and was envious of her brother's much greater freedom and opportunities as a male. He wrote, quote, "Powerful intellect, which should have received the solid nourishment it needed, but which had not been available to her since leaving school. Very monotonous life, limited entirely to the family. She is thoroughly unreligious. Religion played a role in her life only as an object of silent struggles and silent opposition." Hirschmuller's amazing book also contains a 2-page clinical self-description by Bertha herself in English. I will read you just a few excerpts, which you see here. I know it's hard to read. It begins, I, a native German girl, am now totally deprived of the faculty to speak, to understand, or to read German. This symptom lasted during the time of a heavy nervous illness I had to go through, in permanence longer than a year. Since about 4 months, it only returns regularly every evening. Considering my humor, my mental and psychic state during this time, there are some observations to be told. In the first 2 months of my sojourn here, I had shorter or longer absences, which I could observe myself by a strange feeling of time missing. One told me that I used to speak with great vivacity during these absences, but since some weeks, there have been none. It's impressive how clearly Bertha can describe her experience, as well as her awareness of how she is seen by others. Bertha was discharged at the end of October from Bellevue, but according to the psychiatrist, she still was not well. They wrote in her case record, still receiving daily injections of 7 to 10 centigrams of morphine for facial pains. By the way, some of her further troubles came from this morphine addiction and her difficulty withdrawing from it. And in one of her later hospitalizations, they wanted to do surgery on her actual nerves to relieve her pain. And her mother stepped in and said, absolutely not. Continuing with the psychiatrist's report, hysterical features, unpleasant irritation against her family, disparaging judgments against the ineffectiveness of science in regard to her sufferings, and lack of insight into the severity of her nervous condition. Between 1883 and 1887, she was hospitalized 3 more times at Inzersdorf near Vienna. She was always diagnosed with hysteria, and when discharged, the psychiatrist noted that she was fully recovered or at least improved. In 1888, Bertha moved with her mother back to Frankfurt, where her mother's family originated. Her relatives in Frankfurt were rich, cultured, and socially active. Bertha's cousin Louise Goldschmidt recognized how talented Bertha was. Louise encouraged Bertha to work in an orphanage, first reading stories to the children, and she also pushed Bertha to write fiction. Bertha first wrote fairy tales, which she could read to the orphans. She published them at first under a male pseudonym, Paul Berthold. Here you see the English translation of those stories, which is still in print. The stories are beautifully written. They often tell of a disappointed adult finding meaning in life by helping underprivileged people, especially orphans. They seem to be a blueprint for what Bertha would do in her life. She also discovered feminism. Helene Lange became the leading German feminist and published Die Frau, the Woman, a periodical which Bertha read regularly. In 1899, Bertha wrote a play entitled Frauenrecht, Women's Rights. And that same year, she also translated Mary Wollstonecraft's 1792 book, Vindication of the Rights of Women, from English into German. Here's just one excerpt from that book. I shall first consider women in the grand light of human creatures who, in common with men, are placed on this earth to unfold their faculties. Essentially, Bertha Pappenheim cured herself 3 ways. The first was the talking cure that she worked out with Breuer. The second was her writing cure, in which she developed her mind and found a way to express her brilliant ideas to others. And the third was a social cure, in which Bertha changed her role in society, and she changed the society that was making her ill. Bertha attended a women's conference in 1895, and that same year she was appointed director of the Jewish orphanage for girls. She had no experience running an orphanage, but she served in that position effectively for 12 years. In 1902, she traveled to Eastern Europe to investigate trafficking in Jewish women. She wrote about this in her 1924 book, Sisyphusarbeit, Sisyphus work. She called it that because, like Sisyphus, she saw her intense efforts being set back over and over by those involved in the prostitution business. It's astonishing to read about Bertha's bravery and energy as she travels and confronts unsavory pimps and other characters. She also established the Women's Welfare Organization, Care by Women, dedicated to Jewish social work. In 1904, she also founded the League of Jewish Women, Jüdische Frauenbund, and served as its president for 20 years, and she continued to serve on its board until the end of her life. 20% of German Jewish women joined the League, which was an extraordinarily high amount of women. In 1907, she opened a home for Jewish unwed mothers in Neu-Isenburg, which you see here, the main building. She directed this home for 30 years until the end of her life. She also set up the Mädchen Club, the Young Women's Club, which was directed for many years by my great aunt, Aunt Irene Darmstädter. Every night of the week, girls, that is young women, would come to the club, have dinner, and then attend 2 hours of classes. It kept them out of trouble, and it gave them a kind of education that they could not get from formal schooling. It was a kind of freelance university for women, run by women and taught by women. The schedule of the lectures that they heard was published in the Jewish Community newsletter. Copies of the newsletter are now available on the website of the Goethe University in Frankfurt. It's a treasure trove. Here you see 2 issues, one from 1928, with the cover story, a long scholarly discussion of a German writer. And then here is, on the right, is the last issue of the newsletter, published in 1938 in November, right before Kristallnacht. And as you can see, there's not so much academic discussion, it's mostly advertisements. But here in the 1928 issue is a schedule of the Girls' Club's classes. You can see that on Mondays, Bertha Pappenheim led a class named Zeitungslesen, literally newspaper reading, in which they read newspapers and discussed the political and intellectual developments of the day. I wish we could find out how those discussions went in 1935. You can also see that my great aunt, Irene Darmstädter, taught a course in Deutsche Literatur, German literature. And there were courses in French and in English and in handiwork and sewing. It was really quite an extraordinary curriculum. Bertha Pappenheim was very outspoken, and she issued statements that invoked the anger of male religious leaders. She did not mince words. Here are some quotations from her. "If there is any justice in the next life, women will make the laws there, and men will bear the children. Whoever forgoes his freedom without an urgent necessity does not deserve it. If I may be permitted to criticize the Bible, I would say that from the unjust position the Bible assigns to the woman, it is clear that it is the writing of a brilliant but masculine human being, not a divine dictation. In other words, there's no logical, necessary consequence of the differences between the sexes that is ordained by God. Finally, under Jewish law, a woman is not an individual, not a personality. She's only judged and assessed as a sexual being." As you can imagine, she was attacked fiercely for these statements by Orthodox rabbis in the Jewish press. The philosopher Martin Buber was her friend, and he said, "I not only admired her but loved her, and will love her until the day I die. There are people of spirit and there are people of passion, both less common than one might think. Rarer still are the people of spirit and passion, but rarest of all is a passionate spirit. Bertha Pappenheim was a woman with just such a spirit." Bertha Pappenheim was tough with Buber. In 1935, after he visited the home in Neu-Isenburg, she wrote, "Dear Professor Buber, I enjoyed your visit yesterday so much that I have to let you know this and thank you. Not only because I was able to show you the home for unwed Jewish mothers and their children I had founded and defended in my old age in the fight against irrationality, short-sightedness, smoke screens, wishful thinking, and the love of gossip. Even today, I have to shield Isenburg from all of it. But also because I've always had rather peculiar feelings towards you. In person, I feel your warmth and inclination to do good. When you are beyond personal reach, however, I know cognitively and exactly where things are amiss, and forgive me where you are wrong." She goes on to tell him how he is wrong in his writings. In truth, Bertha Pappenheim had many characteristics and views that could be questioned today. She could be rigid and dogmatic. She was strongly anti-Zionist. When Nazism took hold of Germany, she was opposed to sending the children of her orphanage abroad. In the end, most of them ended up being killed in Auschwitz, as was her longtime colleague and best friend, Anna Karminski. Bertha certainly seems to have been able to work hard and be very productive, but she was personally unhappy. In 1911, she wrote this poem, "Love did not come to me. Love did not come to me, so I lived like the plant in the basement without light. Love did not come to me, so I sound like the violin whose bow is broken. Love did not come to me, so I burrow myself in work and live sorely in duty. Love did not come to me, so I think happily on death as a friendly face." This poem, by the way, has been set to music by Harmony James, an Australian singer. The album from 2019 is called Resignation, and the song is called Anna O. You can hear it on YouTube. My mother's cousin, Ruth Dresner, also gave me a book of prayers, Gebete by Bertha Pappenheim, that were privately printed in 1936, the year she died, with the text written out in longhand. Here are two of those prayers translated into English. "I am filled with indignant anger. I shall hold firm to it and let it burn within, so long as conditions justify. I shall not become indulgent. I shall not become blind to acts of hate and harm. I shall not excuse what is inexcusable. Only let me have the strength to protest again and again with anger's indignation against every injustice." And here's another prayer called Thanks. Thanks that I can dam up like a cool mill dike a mental power, voluntary, unforced, sufficient for my own need. But thanks too for the hours when I found words to express what touched me, so that I could influence others. To feel power is to live. To live is to wish to serve. Let me. You can see that she was conscious of her intense anger and the way she funneled it into her work. Now, I also want to mention that in the book Sisyphus Work, there is a dream of Bertha Pappenheim from 1911, the same year as her poem, Love did not come to me. She had the dream while on a boat from Smyrna to Jaffa, a trip to investigate the forced prostitution of women. As far as I know, this dream has never been interpreted adequately, so I'm going to give it a try. I would, of course, like to hear from you about your thoughts on the dream, but I'm going to begin the dream discussion first. Here is the text of the dream. I told my mother I tamed 2 small jackals. Mama would not believe me, so I brought them, and though I was previously quite sure that these were jackals, I now saw myself that I had 2 cats on a leash. I got angry. I pulled the leash, and it was Mr. H and Mr. S. Mama graciously asked them to sit down in the dining room on Leerbachstrasse. Leerbachstrasse was the address of Bertha Pappenheim's home when her mother was still alive. Yet my stateroom actually smelled of real jackals. At the time of the dream, Bertha's mother had been dead for 6 years. You can see from the dream that Bertha still has an intense psychic relationship with her mother and still cares what her mother thinks about her. Bertha has tamed 2 small jackals. As far as I know, jackals are wild dogs, not usually tamed. Are they symbols of the wild men that Bertha has been meeting on her travels and which she tries to tame? Or are they symbols of Bertha herself, angry, wild, and ferocious? Was her illness caused in part by her suppressed rage? Has she made herself healthier by finding a way to use her anger? Then the jackals turn into cats, also descended from ferocious animals, but tame in their domesticated version. Then they turn into men. Of course, we'd like to know more about who Mr. H and Mr. S are, but whoever they are, Bertha's mother does things her way. She graciously invites the men to sit down in the dining room. Bertha Pappenheim was raised to be such a lady, and she could be that way too. Her co-workers spoke about how she would entertain them graciously in her home, but she could also be ferocious toward them when angered at work. Which will she be, animal tamer or gracious host, or both? Jung describes 2 approaches to a dream, the objective approach and the subjective approach. In the objective approach, everyone in the dream is who they are. I am I, Mama is Mama, and the jackals are jackals until they are cats or men. However, in the subjective approach to the dream, everyone in the dream is an aspect of the dreamer. Mama is the aspect of me that is genteel, refined, and courteous to men. The jackals are the wild animal part of me that may be tamed. The cats are the in-between wild animal and domestic pet aspects of me. And Mr. H and Mr. S are my male identified selves. In the dream, when Bertha is angered that the jackals are cats, she pulls on the leash. One could say generally that a leash may symbolize a means of control. Bertha was known to be quite controlling of others. It's said that in organizational meetings, she spoke forcefully and almost always got her way. How much has she identified with her mother? How much has she differentiated herself from her mother? How does this dream reflect Bertha's attitude towards men and her mother's attitude towards men? In the end, Bertha smells real jackals. No matter how much more civilized and refined the situation becomes, there is still the animal smell that remains. Visceral olfactory disgust is not amenable to conscious control. Perhaps Bertha is disgusted by men and their smell. Mama is not. The Nazis took power in 1933. In 1935, they passed the Nuremberg laws that took away the civil rights of Jews. They also held the enormous Nuremberg rally. There was a vicious anti-Semitic newspaper, The Stormer, that published a set of special editions in honor of the Nuremberg rally. You see here the first of those issues. In it, they specifically wrote about the Jewish slave trade that had been exposed by Bertha Pappenheim. They quoted her and used what she had written to vilify Jews in general. Then in 1936, when Bertha was sick with intestinal cancer, a mentally deficient child at the home in Neu-Isenburg made an anti-Hitler remark, which was reported to the Gestapo by a non-Jewish employee at the home. The Gestapo summoned Bertha. Although sick and weak, she appeared and defended herself and the child. She told them no one could hold a mentally deficient child responsible for what he said. They released her. She died at Neu-Isenburg in the next month. Here is her obituary in the Jewish community newsletter. You can see it says, Bertha Pappenheim, Neu-Isenburg, died at the age of 77. In one of her published prayers, she imagines her gravestone. I will read that prayer too. Wind blows over the graves. Sunlight lies on the stones. Drop by drop, memories trickle through my thoughts. I lay a small stone on the dear spot, and childless, wish for myself small memorial stones placed on the rim of the red stone, with the inscription, she was very strict. She was very strict. Some people seem to think that her gravestone reads that way, but they are wrong. Here's her actual gravestone. It is inscribed with Psalm 113. He settles the childless woman in her home as a happy mother of children. In 1954, the German government issued a postage stamp with Bertha Pappenheim's picture and the inscription, benefactor of mankind. I think it is time to reevaluate Bertha Pappenheim's contribution to psychiatry, clinical psychology, social work, and psychoanalysis. Freud himself acknowledged that Pappenheim and Breuer originated the technique of tracing a symptom back to its causal roots that became part of psychoanalysis. But Bertha brought many other significant innovations to mental health work during her career. In her own life, she found out how she was constrained by a society and family that strictly limited how she could be educated because she was a woman. She used her formidable intelligence and moral strength to defend women who were disadvantaged and abused. During her career in Frankfurt, she had identified ways that psychopathology can be caused, at least in part, by societal pathology, and she found ways to change that societal pathology. This is an issue that's been given too little attention in psychoanalysis. When someone is in a persecuted group whose life is limited and made painful or dangerous by society's structure, what is the solution? Must the individual's psychology change? Must the individual's relation to society change? Or must society itself change? To what degree was hysteria a product of the limited roles that women experienced? Bertha Pappenheim may have cured her own illness by becoming aware of the limitations on her life and how she might change them. In her actions to protect women who are sold into sexual slavery, to protect women who become pregnant outside of marriage and their children, she found a way to use her intelligence and moral courage in a highly effective way. Also, she worked to open up the minds and lives of the Jewish women she knew in Frankfurt. As Ruth Dresner told me, Bertha Pappenheim talked to these married, wealthy ladies who are not doing much and asked them to use their wealth and their time to help others. In this way, she was curing a small part of female society from their limitations. She was opening up a world where they could help other women and where their ability to rise was not limited by their gender. Bertha Pappenheim established organizations like Care by Women, the Home in Neu-Isenburg, the League of Jewish Women, and the Girls Club. All of these were micro-worlds in which women were respected, in which they were the leaders, educators, and innovators, and so their mental health would be greatly enhanced. This is a principle that has many applications in our society. People whose psychological functioning is compromised or damaged by societal limitations and persecution, who can generally improve mental health by changing their environment, nurturing their abilities, and protecting them as much as possible from prejudice. This principle was explored with psychotic gay men by the great American psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan. In the late 1920s, Sullivan created his famous ward for gay schizophrenic men at the Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Maryland. The staff, handpicked by Sullivan, were either openly homosexual or easygoing about it. The staff members were encouraged to talk casually to each other about homosexual experiences, to let the patients feel that it was not something to be ashamed of or afraid of. And the ward had an astonishing 86% cure rate. I've written about this in my article, The Gay Harry Stack Sullivan, and Naoko Wake wrote about it more extensively in her book, Private Practices, Harry Stack Sullivan, The Science of Homosexuality in American Liberalism. Sullivan's ward represented a brilliant insight into the factors that can lead to serious mental illness and the best approach to helping such patients. Gay people disposed to mental illness, either because of a genetic predisposition, a traumatic history, or other factors, the added stress of anti-homosexual hatred in society can push them over the edge into psychosis. Sullivan showed with his ward that removing a gay man temporarily into an environment that was accepting of his sexuality could facilitate remarkable clinical improvement. This is similar to the way Bertha Pappenheim improved her own mental health and that of other women in her society by creating environments where women were respected, protected from prejudice, and given opportunities to use their talents. You may think it odd for me to pair Bertha Pappenheim and Harry Stack Sullivan. Certainly they were different in many ways. Pappenheim was born rich cosmopolitan and German Jewish. Sullivan was born poor, rural, and Irish American Catholic. Yet despite such major social differences, they had some things in common. They each belonged to a group who faced prejudice and restrictions in society. Pappenheim as a woman, and Sullivan as a gay man. Each faced a major mental health crisis in late adolescence. Sullivan dropped out of college after the first year, and we don't know what happened to him for the next 2 years of his life. Sullivan and Pappenheim each struggled to find a way to resolve their personal issues, realize their creative potential, and protect other people who face prejudice. Each sought to understand how prejudice interacted with personal psychodynamics and were major innovators in what today we call psychoanalysis. There are 3 stages in much psychoanalytic and psychiatric thinking about the psychopathology of groups that suffer prejudice. It starts with an acceptance of society standards and an identification of the distress and the dysfunction of the individual as a problem inherent in the individual. Gradually, often too gradually, there's recognition that the individual may be suffering not from an inherent interpsychic neurosis, but from persistent disruption of living caused by societal oppression. There is then a second intermediate stage in which some theorists identify this maltreatment and a growing recognition that the individual's problems can be cured not just by intrapsychic change, but rather by changing the individual's relation to society. Finally, there's the third stage, in which there is recognition that for the optimal resolution of psychopathology, Society itself must change. Kurt Goldstein, who was a mentor to Frieda von Reichmann, believed this. He wrote in 1957, "Psychotherapy should be performed at least with the hope for a better organization of society, that is, one which better fits human nature. Today, psychotherapy is very often doomed to remain patchwork. Psychotherapy will be successful only when we believe that conditions can, in principle, be changed for the better." Bertha Pappenheim and Harry Stack Sullivan showed us that the mental health of a persecuted group can be radically improved by enhancing the social situation, the possibilities in life, and the average expectable environment. It's a principle that we need to explore further. For example, in the United States today, two groups that face inordinate discrimination, life limitations, and danger are African Americans and transgender people. How much would the mental health of these groups be improved if they were protected from a society that harms them, and if they were situated in an environment that valued their contributions consistently? How much could their mental health improve if society was radically changed? We've seen how Bertha Pappenheim explored this principle for the sake of herself and the women of her time. After having co-invented psychoanalysis, Bertha Pappenheim showed us how social therapy, creating settings where stressful, persecutory, and restrictive social conditions are improved or corrected, can become a part of mental health treatment that helps those who are troubled and prevents future psychopathology. Bertha Pappenheim and Harry Stack Sullivan both found an intersection in the ways to cure oneself and one's society.